Have you ever taken a test that just felt, completely unfair? Like maybe the questions were way too hard, or the time was way too short. But have you ever taken a test that was mathematically, literally at the code level, rigged to make you fail? Well, welcome to our Digital Detective Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack what is absolutely one of the most fascinating cyber mysteries in recent gaming history. Okay, let's dive right into this. So we're looking at the viral indie horror sensation, Baldi's Basics in Education and Learning. And for years, right, players were literally tormented by this one game mechanic that seemed totally unsolvable. I mean, it was a glitch that drove the entire community completely crazy. But recently, this super dedicated group of data miners and programmers, they actually cracked this hard-coded, unanswerable trap. And we're going to explore exactly how they pulled off this digital heist. Here's our case file for today's explainer. First, what exactly is Baldi's Basics? Then, the characters. 3, the impossible question itself. 4, how they actually solved it. 5, the creator's reaction. And we'll wrap up with a summary and conclusion. All right, Chapter 1. What is Baldi's Basics? The 90s edutainment trap. So this game was created back in 2018 by an independent developer named Micah McGonigal, who goes by Mistman12 online. And at first glance, it looks like this super innocent mid-90s throwback, kind of like Sonic Schoolhouse. But actually, it's a total trap. See, traditional edutainment relies on this nice, safe, transactional loop of learning. You input the correct answer, you get positive reinforcement, and you move on. While Baldi's Basics takes that innocent loop and completely weaponizes it. It turns a simple math quiz into a high-stakes survival horror chase. Because if you make even one tiny mistake, the teacher turns hostile, and the punishment is frankly terrifying. And the core mechanic driving all this horror is this little green device called the You Can ThinkPad, which is just a brilliant dual homage to those chunky Lenovo ThinkPad laptops and the Casio ClassPad calculators from the late 90s. Anyway, every single time you collect one of the game's notebooks, this device pops up to administer a 3-question arithmetic test. It's the central testing mechanic of the game and honestly, the gateway to your doom. Moving on to Chapter 2, the characters, or as I like to call them, the suspects in the schoolhouse. So who's actually enforcing all these crazy rules? Well, we have this completely bizarre cast of AI threats just roaming these digital hallways. You've got the principal of the thing handing out detentions left and right, and these really creepy, glitchy entities like null or filename2 just kind of lurking in the code. But the absolute primary threat here is Baldi himself. He's this intentionally poorly modeled CGI humanoid teacher with exactly one single strand of hair, a bright green shirt, and a ruler that he is constantly slapping against his hand. And Baldi isn't just a scary face, right? He's actually driven by a ruthless mathematical formula. So every time you get a question wrong on the You Can Think pad, Baldi's quote-unquote kinetic threat vector increases. To put that into perspective, the game applies a 0.25-second anger penalty to his hit speed for every single wrong answer. So the delay between his steps compresses. He gets faster, the ruler slaps get louder, and your window to react shrinks down to basically 0. That brings us to Chapter 3, the impossible question, the murder weapon. Now, if getting questions wrong makes the game exponentially harder, what happens when the game intentionally gives you an unsolvable prompt? Well, when you reach the 3rd question of the second notebook, Standard Edition just completely goes out the window. The prompt devolves into this crazy, chaotic overlay of corrupted text, loud buzzes, and just overlapping symbols. The rendering engine literally stacks 3 distinct layers of randomized offset numerical characters right on top of one another. It totally obscures the actual math problem, making it structurally unreadable, and of course, completely unanswerable. So what's actually happening under the hood? Inside the game's compiled C# execution layer, specifically in something called the math game script, there's this Boolean flag literally called impossible mode. And when you hit that 3rd question, this flag shifts from 0, which means false, to 1, meaning true. This architectural flag essentially acts like a huge digital padlock over the 3rd question. It overrides the standard rendering, completely hard-coding you to fail. There's just no way around it. And here's the kicker. The entire meta-narrative of the game absolutely relies on you getting this wrong. When you fail, the music just stops. Baldi frowns, huge text pops up on the screen saying, "I hear every door you open," and the survival horror chase officially begins. In fact, memory analysis showed that the game's initialization routines strictly depend on you submitting an incorrect answer, because if you somehow didn't fail, the game actually fails to load its standard chase parameters. It would just leave the schoolhouse completely empty and non-reactive. Okay, let's move on to Chapter 4 and see how this builds. How they solved it, the forensic breakthrough. Let's look at the incredible technical heist our digital detectives pulled off here. Because to break this digital safe, modders really had to reverse engineer the game's proprietary scripting. First, they started by attaching a memory manipulation utility called Cheat Engine directly to the game's executable. Then they used mono dissection tools to literally crawl through the Unity C# classes. They located that specific math game script we talked about earlier, found that sneaky impossible mode flag sitting there in the active memory, and manually manipulated the Boolean value from a 1 straight back down to a 0.
But wow, the game's architecture is fiercely retaliatory. If you just force a correct answer through memory injection, the software actually calls specific anti-cheat routines. The system instantly realizes you violated the intended execution state, and doing this triggers a metafictional entity called glitched Baldi, accompanied by a super creepy voice from the character Philname2 declaring, "That isn't fair, you cheated." The file structure then undergoes this mock corruption and intentionally crashes the entire game. It's wild.
So how do they actually win? Well, according to a report by BBC News, a team of programmers managed to bypass the user interface entirely. A programmer known as Bitcracker and their team discovered that they could inject a specific hex code sequence into the memory buffer at the exact microsecond the question loaded. This successfully satisfied the logic controller without triggering that anti-cheat reprisal. The distorted audio just cut out, and this hidden, completely uncorrupted audio file played, simply saying, "Wow, you exist." Chapter 5. How the creators reacted. The aftermath. So how do you think the developer and the world responded to this massive breakthrough? After years of this puzzle just sitting there in the dark, the creator, Mistman12, had always maintained that the question basically wasn't meant to be solved. I mean, it didn't technically contain a correct state in the normal user interface at all. Independent gaming historian Laura Croft actually summarized it perfectly. She called it a narrative dead end masquerading as a technical error. It was just a hard-coded trick designed purely to force the player right into the horror experience. But, the community's ingenuity just could not be stopped. As Bitcracker explained in that BBC News report, we essentially fooled the game into believing that infinity and zero were being submitted at the exact same time. And the game engine didn't crash. It actually accepted it. It is just a true testament to how incredibly dedicated players are to uncovering digital secrets, literally building their own keys for doors that were never, ever meant to be opened. Finally, Chapter 6, Summary and Conclusion. Case closed? So the crucial point here is, what started out as a goofy parody evolved into one of the most compelling cyber whodunits we've honestly ever seen. To quickly recap our case file, we traced Baldi's basics from its roots as this innocent 90s edutainment parody straight into a terrifying survival horror. We saw how the game literally weaponized the impossible mode Boolean to mathematically guarantee your failure and crank up Baldi's kinetic threat vector. And we watched as dedicated players engineered a brilliant memory injection heist to bypass those anti-cheat crashes, ultimately uncovering that hidden audio response buried deep, deep in the code. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. When a developer explicitly designs a game to be unsolvable, that's a core part of their artistic vision, right? But when the community spends literally years reverse engineering that exact same code just to find a tiny sliver of light in the dark, it really begs the question. Does breaking a game's code destroy its artistic intent? Or does it simply create a brand new, highly collaborative way to play? Really think about that the next time you face an impossible test. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep your curiosity sharp.